What kind of father carries his own newborn baby into a frozen forest and abandons him naked in the snow to die of cold? Who examines a newborn as if it were livestock, checking muscle strength and clarity in the eyes before deciding if it deserves to live? What kind of Viking mother hands over her own child to be thrown from a cliff because he was born with a birthmark considered a curse from the gods? Imagine that you are in 10th century Norway. It is a freezing winter dawn, and you hear a baby's cry coming from the forest. When you follow the sound, you find a child of just a few days, abandoned naked on the snow, crying until it has no more strength. Beside it, a spear driven into the earth with runes that say, "Odin has decided." The baby is slowly dying of cold, and this is no accident. It is tradition. They sold you the image of the Viking as a brave warrior who protected his family above all else. They told you about devoted fathers who fought to the death for their children, about the sacred value of family lineage, about clans united against the hostile world. They showed you movies where Vikings cry over the death of their babies and make oaths of revenge. But they never told you that the Vikings themselves systematically killed their newborn children for reasons that go far beyond survival. The truth is that in Viking culture, having a baby did not guarantee that it would live more than a week. Each child that was born went through a brutal selection process called utburdur, where parents coldly decided whether the newborn deserved the resources necessary to survive the Nordic winter. We are talking about a society where examining a baby like merchandise was not only accepted, but mandatory, where parents had specific lists of defects that justified immediate infanticide, where mothers were trained from girlhood to suppress any maternal instinct until the child was officially accepted by the family. You think you know what the struggle for survival means, but the Vikings lived in an environment so hostile that keeping a weak child alive meant condemning the entire family to death. Winters of 8 months with temperatures that killed healthy adults. Resources so scarce that an extra mouth to feed could mean the difference between living and dying. But the Utburdur was not just about resources. It was about creating the strongest race of warriors on Earth. Vikings believed that allowing weak or deformed children to survive weakened the entire lineage. Each baby that was born was evaluated as a future warrior, or a future matrix of warriors. Imagine being a Viking, mother giving birth for the first time. You cannot hold your baby. You cannot breastfeed. You cannot even look into the child's eyes until the clan elders examine every inch of the body looking for signs of weakness. If they find any defect, your baby will be taken immediately to die in the forest. For centuries, historians romanticized Viking culture, focusing only on the navigations and conquests. They hid records that revealed the darker side of this society. A human natural selection machine that produced perfect warriors by eliminating any trace of weakness from birth. The Icelandic sagas themselves, written by the Vikings themselves, document the Utburdur as a practice as common as planting grains or building boats. It was not considered infanticide. It was considered human gardening, removing weak plants so that the strong ones could flourish. And it worked. The artificial selection practiced by the Vikings for centuries created a population of physically superior men and women who dominated medieval Europe through brute force. But the price of this superiority was paid in the lives of babies who never had a chance to prove their worth. Because the Utburdur was not just abandoning children in the forest. It was a complex evaluation system that included resistance tests, specific selection criteria, and religious rituals that transformed infanticide into a sacred ceremony dedicated to the gods. And now you will discover exactly how this system worked. Criteria that determined which babies lived or died, specific methods of elimination, and the role of Viking women in this selection process that challenges everything we think about maternal instinct. What I am going to reveal to you in the next few minutes is not in the movies that glorify Viking culture. It is documented in the Nordic sagas themselves, in archaeological excavations that found baby cemeteries, in records of Christian missionaries who were horrified by what they witnessed. Because the truth about what the Vikings did with unwanted babies is not just medieval history, it is a brutal lesson about how far human beings are capable of going when survival becomes more important than compassion. To understand how the Utburder became a sacred tradition, you need to know Eric Bloodaxe, king of Norway between 930 and 934, known not only for his military conquests, but for having codified the infant selection rituals that transformed the Vikings into the most feared military force in medieval Europe. Eric was not an ignorant barbarian. He was a strategic leader who understood that his military superiority depended on the genetic quality of his people. During his reign, he established scientific criteria for the Utburder that ensured that only children with maximum potential for war reached adulthood. The first codification of the Utburder happened in the winter of 932, when Eric lost half of his warriors in a battle against the Danes. He realized that his men were physically inferior to the enemies and decided that the only way to reverse this disadvantage was through systematic artificial selection. This was the Viking mentality. Every problem had a violent and practical solution. If the warriors were weak, the solution was not better training or equipment. It was to eliminate weak genes from the cradle and create a super race through generations of controlled selection. Eric established 9 mandatory criteria that every newborn had to pass to be accepted by the family. First, grasping reflexes. The baby was suspended by a rope over a 3-meter pit. If it could not hold on for at least 30 seconds, it was dropped and died. But this was just the beginning. Second criterion, resistance to cold. The newborn was left naked in the snow for 1 hour. If it survived without signs of hypothermia, it passed to the next test. Third, total absence of physical deformities. Any mark, scar, or bodily asymmetry resulted in immediate elimination. The remaining 6 criteria were even more specific and brutal. Fourth, lung capacity, tested by forcing the baby to cry continuously for 2 hours. Fifth, muscle strength, measured by the ability to resist pressure applied to the limbs. Sixth, visual clarity, verified through reaction to bright objects. Gunnlaug Ormstunga, an Icelandic skald who witnessed Eric's rituals, documented that the king established tests that separated future wolves from lambs still in the cradle. His saga describes ceremonies where dozens of babies were tested simultaneously, with only 1 or 2 surviving all the criteria. But the most disturbing aspect was not the physical tests. It was how Eric religiously justified these practices. He preached that Odin, the father of all gods, would only accept in Valhalla warriors who had proven worth from birth. Babies who failed the tests were considered rejected by the gods themselves. Eric created a specialized priestly body called Vali, responsible for administering the tests and interpreting divine will. These priests were trained to suppress any emotion during the rituals, treating babies as objects to be evaluated, not as human beings. The Utburder ceremonies became community events where entire families participated in the selection. Parents were taught to see the elimination of weak children as an act of religious devotion. Mothers who showed sadness over the death of rejected babies were publicly shamed as weak and unworthy of generating warriors. Gunnlaug recorded that Eric personally participated in the most important rituals, especially when children of his own elite warriors were born. He believed that his presence during the selection guaranteed that only children truly blessed by Odin would survive. Eric's system worked so well that other Viking leaders began to adopt similar versions. In 2 generations, the Utburders spread throughout Scandinavia, creating populations of physically superior warriors who dominated Europe. For centuries, But there was still a logistical problem. What to do with the rejected babies? Simply killing them would be wasteful. Eric discovered ways to transform even the elimination of unwanted children into military and economic advantage. He established 3 categories of elimination: immediate death for serious defects, prolonged exposure for minor defects, and a third category that no modern historian can completely define because the records were deliberately destroyed by the Vikings themselves. Gunnlaug only mentions that babies in this third category were prepared to serve the gods in a special way. What this meant exactly remains a mystery, but archaeological evidence suggests practices even more disturbing than simple infanticide. But this was just the beginning. The elimination methods developed by Eric were not just abandoning children in the forest. They were specific techniques designed to extract information about the child's genetic resistance before death. Eric transformed infanticide into applied science, collecting data about which lineages produced superior warriors. Gradual exposure was the most common method for babies with minor defects. The child was left naked on a stone platform built specifically for this purpose, surrounded by a low fence that prevented wild animals from abbreviating the suffering. The objective was to observe exactly how long the baby could survive alone. Eric kept detailed records of these exposures. Babies who were children of elite warriors were expected to survive at least 3 days. Children of farmers or artisans had lower expectations. If a child exceeded the expectations for its lineage, it was sometimes rescued and accepted into the family as proof of unexpected superior genes. This was the reality of Viking science, using human babies as experiments to determine which families produced the best raw material for war. Each infant death was recorded as data to improve the selection of the next generations. But Viking women were not just passive observers of this process. They were active participants who developed their own selection methods that were, in many aspects, more cruel than those of the men. And this was not the worst part. The selection nights were exclusively feminine ceremonies where mothers of rejected babies competed to see who could eliminate their own child in the most honorable way. It was not just about killing the child. It was about publicly demonstrating that they deserved to generate future warriors through the ability to suppress any maternal instinct. Astrid Eriksdottir, daughter of Erik Bludax himself, led these ceremonies. Gunnlaug documented that she taught women to transform maternal love into fuel for superior selection, making mothers compete to see who would kill their own child with greater coldness. The competitions included specific methods that tested both the mother's resolve and the baby's final resistance. Exposure on ice, gradual submersion in icy water, food deprivation while the child was forced to hear the crying of other babies being fed. Astrid believed that mothers who showed hesitation during elimination were genetically programmed to generate weak children. Women who killed their own rejected babies without showing emotion were considered superior matrices and had priority to become pregnant by the most valued warriors. And this was not the worst part, because Eric discovered that rejected babies had economic value when sold to other tribes. Children considered inadequate for Viking warriors could be perfectly acceptable for farmers or merchants from other regions who had less rigorous selection standards. He established specific trade routes where rejected Viking babies were exchanged for scarce resources. A healthy child but with minor defects could yield enough iron to make 3 spear points. Babies with more serious defects were sold to tribes that used them as slaves or ritual sacrifices. Gunnlaug recorded that Eric transformed the elimination of weak children into a source of income that financed the raising of strong children. It was a complete economic system based on the exportation of rejected genetic material. But the most efficient aspect was how different Viking tribes competed with each other to see who maintained the most rigorous selection standards. Clans that accepted babies with defects were considered weak and became preferential targets for war raids. And this was not the worst part, because when resources became extremely scarce during long winters, even babies who had passed the initial selection could be re-evaluated and eliminated if the family could not support all the children. Eric established criteria for this second selection that were even more brutal than the originals. Children from 1 to 2 years old were forced to compete physically with each other for food. Those who showed weakness or hesitation in hurting other children were eliminated immediately. Parents were obliged to watch and vote on which children deserved to live when resources were not sufficient for everyone. Astrid developed selection games, where siblings were forced to fight until only one survived. She believed this guaranteed that only the strongest child from each family reached adulthood, maximizing the genetic quality of the next generation. Mothers were trained to treat these games as religious festivals, celebrating when the strongest child killed the weaker siblings. Women who showed sadness over the death of eliminated children were marked as weak mothers and prevented from having more children. And this was not the worst part, because what Gunnlaug discovered in Eric's most secret records revealed that he had developed a special category of rejected babies who were neither killed nor sold. They were kept alive for a specific purpose that directly connected the Utburder with the most sacred war rituals of the Vikings. A practice that transformed unwanted children into the most powerful military weapon the Vikings had ever developed. The special category of rejected babies discovered by Gunnlaug in Eric's records was called blotburn, or sacrifice children. These were children who had failed the selection tests but demonstrated exceptional resistance during the elimination process. Instead of dying, they were kept alive for a very specific purpose: to serve as living human offerings to Odin before great battles. Eric had discovered that the sacrifice of children during war rituals was much more effective than sacrificing animals or adult slaves. Babies represented absolute innocence, and their death in Odin's name supposedly guaranteed divine protection for the warriors during combat. But it was not just about killing the children. Eric developed elaborate rituals where blotburn babies were raised specifically to maximize the value of their sacrifice. They were fed milk mixed with blood from dead warriors, grew up isolated from any normal human contact, and were conditioned from birth to accept death as sacred destiny. Gunnlaug documented that he found special cells where dozens of children between 6 months and 3 years old were kept as sacred livestock, fattened and prepared for offering to the gods of war. These children did not learn to speak, did not receive names, and were treated as ritual objects from birth. The most diabolical aspect was how Eric synchronized the sacrifices with the children's development. 6-month-old babies were considered ideal for minor battles. 2-year-old children were reserved for important wars. 3-year-old children, who already showed personality and fear, were sacrificed only for the most critical invasions because their terror supposedly fed Odin's fury. And it worked in a terrifying way. Records from Viking enemies describe warriors who seemed possessed by demons after participating in rituals where children were burned alive on stone altars. The Vikings themselves believed that innocent blood spilled before battle temporarily transformed them into physical aspects of Odin on Earth. But Eric went even further. He discovered that some blotburn children demonstrated such exceptional resistance to conditioning that they could be transformed into something different: berserkers created from birth. These special children were subjected to a 3-year process that combined total isolation, constant physical pain, and conditioning to suppress any normal human instinct. The objective was to create warriors who felt no pain, fear, or compassion from early childhood. Gunnlaug recorded that Eric maintained approximately 20 of these children in constant development, all daughters of warriors who had died in battle and had been rejected in the original Utburder. They were raised like wolves, without knowing human love, fed only raw meat, and trained to kill from the moment they could stand upright. The conditioning included methods that challenged the imagination. 2-year-old children were forced to kill small animals with their own hands. 3-year-old children fought each other until one became unconscious. At 4 years old, they were capable of feeling pleasure only through extreme violence. And the results were terrifying. The berserkers created through this process became the most feared warriors in all of medieval Europe. They were not men who entered fury during battle. They were children who had been systematically transformed into human predators incapable of any emotion other than bloodthirst. But in 975, something happened that changed everything. Eric Bloodaxe's conversion to Christianity was not spiritual, it was political. He realized that other European kingdoms were uniting specifically to exterminate the Vikings because of practices like the Utburder and child sacrifices. The very barbarism that made the Vikings invincible was uniting all of Christian Europe against them. King Olaf Tryggvason, Eric's successor, ordered the immediate end of all infant selection practices, not out of compassion, but out of strategic necessity. The Vikings needed Christian allies to survive politically, and the Utburder had become an insurmountable barrier to any alliance. The transition was violent. Thousands of Vikings who refused to abandon traditional practices were killed by their own leaders. The cells of Blotburn children were emptied not through liberation, but through mass elimination to erase evidence. The berserkers created from infancy were the last to be eliminated. Many had become so conditioned to violence that they could not function in a society that was trying to Christianize itself. They were hunted and killed like wild animals by Vikings who were trying to integrate into the Christian world, and thus ended one of the most systematically cruel practices in human history. The Utburder was not abandoned through moral evolution. It was abandoned out of political necessity when it became inconvenient for the survival of the Vikings themselves. Compassion did not defeat barbarism. Political convenience defeated barbarism. The truth about what the Vikings did with unwanted babies reveals something fundamental about human nature: that there is no practice too cruel to be justified when a society believes its survival depends on it, and that even the most entrenched traditions disappear instantly when they become politically inconvenient. The Vikings did not become more civilized. They simply discovered that civilization was more useful for conquest than pure barbarism. And when they made this discovery, they eliminated without hesitation centuries of tradition that included the systematic murder of their own children.